My cell phone was ringing on my bedside table at 2 in the morning. I'd forgotten to turn it to silent when I went to sleep. It was rare I would get calls from clients so late at night. But it did happen on occasion. Normally I would let it ring and check the voicemail in the morning, still half asleep. I looked at the number. It was Nick. He was a government agent that dealt with supernatural threats. I've been pretty useless on the 2 jobs we had already been on together. And yet he still called me up asking if I could join him on another case. I made a mistake and answered with the following. "What's up, Snickerdoodle?" Shit. Recently I've been trying to think of nicknames to call him because it seems as if he enjoyed them. I've mentally made a list of names to use and rejected some which I would never call him, due to my half-asleep state. I used a name from the wrong list. There was a long pause as I heard him whisper the word under his breath and heard the rustling of paper. Faintly I heard a notebook close and I knew he wrote down the nickname. I would never forgive myself for this, putting aside that trauma. I listened to the reason why he had called so late. "There is a bit of an emergency. Can you be ready within 5 minutes? Bring warm clothing and a weapon if you have one," Nick explained, not sounding fazed by the greeting. I was already out of bed trying to get dressed when he spoke. Whatever is going down must be a big deal if he's rushing me out the door. I wondered how dangerous this job would be. He never told me to bring a weapon before. Normally I leaned on him to do all the heavy lifting. I wanted to change that though. So after the last case I went out and got a handgun. I also went to the range a few times to practice shooting. And made sure I gave the weapon all the respect it deserved. Honestly, it made me a little nervous just having it in the apartment. If I didn't live alone, I would have bought a gun safe for it. "Yeah, I can be ready. Where should I meet you?" I asked. "I'll come to your door, but I need your permission to use it." Now that was a strange thing to ask. I told him he could and he quickly got off the phone. The new case brought danger, but I was thinking more about the payday it would bring. No matter how much I worked, I didn't appear closer to my goals. However, my excitement faded when I placed my new handgun inside a side holster after checking the safety over 10 times. I had wanted to be a cop, but a private investigator was the best I could do. I was never aware of how nervous guns made me until after I actually owned one. I told myself it was just first-time jitters that I hoped would fade, just as I was tossing on my jacket. A knock came from my front door. When I opened it, a blast of cold air came through along with snow. It was still spring, but closer to summer. There shouldn't be any snow. Nick stood on the other side of the doorway. But the outside was not my apartment building hallway. I was looking off at a snow-covered mountainside landscape. "What the hell?" I said slowly, wondering if I was still dreaming. "The corporation is able to connect 2 doors together to make travel time faster," Nick explained as if this was a common thing. I blinked a few times before stepping out into the ankle-deep snow. The wind nearly blew me off my feet and I quickly zipped up my jacket. When I closed the door behind us, it disappeared, leaving behind 3 long branches, 2 stuck in the ground and 1 on top, making it look like a frame my apartment door fit inside of moments ago. Apparently the doorways that could connect 2 locations together didn't need to be a real door. They just needed to look like one. "It's not a long walk. I'll explain the case when we get somewhere warm," Nick said and started to walk away. I followed behind along a snow-buried road. I could only tell it was a road because of the pathway through the trees. Nick was only wearing his suit along with a pink scarf that was flowing in the wind. How he wasn't cold was beyond me. I shivered, tucking my hands into my coat pockets while wondering if it wasn't too late to turn back. Another burst of wind stung my face, making my eyes water. "How are you not freezing?" I asked, trying to keep moving forward. He stopped to look over his shoulder to watch how I jogged on the spot, trying to stay warm. Without a word, he took off his scarf to wrap it under my chin. The gesture made me feel warmer than the garment. "The cold doesn't bother me," he said, and it looked true. His face wasn't even flushed. "Okay then, Elsa," I chuckled. Nick turned his head slightly, not understanding the reference. I waved it off so we could keep moving. The walk was under 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. My socks were soaked through and I knew I was going to get sick from the walk. The scenery would have been beautiful if it wasn't for the weather. Under the snow was a building I didn't notice at first, as it blended into the mountain it was built into. Nick paused at a large steel door while trying to open it with a keypad next to it. I watched, shivering while looking around for any other signs of life. When the codes Nick entered didn't work, he took out a black marker to write under the keypad. With practiced skill, he drew a circle, then some odd symbols surrounding it. When he was finished, he pricked his finger to place a dot of blood in the center of the circle and symbols. With a click, the door started to open and his writing faded away, regardless of the danger that would be inside. I rushed into the building. Nick was right behind me as the door closed, shutting out the cold. Inside, the building was dark, with red emergency lights flickering along the hallway. We stayed near the entrance so Nick could explain what was going on as I shook the chill from my bones. This is a research facility owned by the hunters. They haven't told us much aside that some sort of infection was released. It appears to not spread by normal methods, and whatever is the cause is possibly supernatural in origin. There are 48 people still left inside the building. If we come across anyone, we shall assume they're hostile. Do not let them get close. I nodded along, listening as dread started to creep into my stomach. This was a step up from finding a lost girl or looking for a killer. This case was real secret government stuff. I let my hand touch where my handgun was holstered, but wasn't comforted by it as I had hoped. Don't you think this is a bit much for the two of us? I asked, sounding nervous. The red hallway looked more menacing with this new information. This was way beyond my skill set. I didn't know anything about infections or disease. It was a comfort knowing I wasn't exposed to some mystery illness just being inside the building, and the lack of other information overshadowed any positives. We shall have another team arriving in an hour or so. There is another emergency going on, so all the other agents are occupied. The hunters trained to deal with this lab were inside at the time of the outbreak and are assumed dead. Right now, we are the only team available. Because I'd warmed up, Nick started to walk down the hallway. Inside the building it was so hot that I needed to unzip my jacket to stop from sweating. He paused at a door, hand at his side ready to strike if something came at him. Carefully, he opened the door to check inside the room. When nothing of interest was inside, he started to draw another circle, this time directly on the steel door. What's the doodling for? I asked as I watched him. It's a basic spell to keep the door locked. We need to check every part of the building and lock up areas behind us to ensure nothing goes inside after we leave. I'm not overly talented when it comes to magic. All the power for the spell is stored inside the marker. If you were able to draw the circle and the writing, then you could do this spell as well. Nick finished up his small circle to move on the next door in the long, dimly lit hallway. A magic marker. Really? I guess if witches and trolls are real, a marker could be magic. I debated asking if other things are real like Bigfoot or aliens, but knew it was not the right time for such a conversation. I stayed behind Nick as we checked inside empty rooms, on high alert and expecting to encounter danger at any moment. My nerves felt fried in just a few minutes. Every faint sound made me tense and look around, simply to find nothing there. Nick didn't appear as stressed, but his face never looked as if he was experiencing much of anything. My hand kept hovering above my holster, ready to draw if needed. I thought I was ready for this kind of case. But when the danger finally showed itself, I was proven very wrong. We found ourselves walking through a curved hallway while clearing rooms. When Nick went inside, I kept a lookout on the hallway. He was never gone for more than a few minutes. So far, I didn't see any signs of death or distress. The building appeared normal aside from the emergency lights and lack of residents. I heard a sound coming from the room Nick went inside of. I was about to rush over to check on him when something else caught my attention. I had heard groaning from a few feet away. Panicked, I turned my head to find the source. A man wearing a lab coat was shuffling down the hallway in an uneven gait. He bumped against walls and nearly tripped over his own feet. I choked in fear after seeing him. His face was pale, and this man looked and acted like a fresh zombie. And for good reason. Out from his chest sprouted a bulb that was about the size of my head. I could see vines growing from the parasitic bulb going into the man's chest. When he raised a hand, more vines poked out from his skin, showing his entire body was infected with them under his flesh. I drew my handgun and prepared to fire, when more noises came from behind me. 4 more of the infected were coming down the hallway. These men were dressed in SWAT gear from head to toe, with the exception of the heavy-duty vest, which had been removed to make room for the bulbs. I didn't know if the infection made them take the vests off, or if they were caught before they were fully suited up. They groaned as they bumped against each other. I let out a yell of surprise when Nick came shooting out from the dark room. He didn't say a word, taking off like a bullet. He attacked the group of SWAT men in a blur of motion I couldn't fully follow. His form a graceful blur of attacks. I listened for the sound of his sword but didn't hear it. Instead of the delicate sword he normally used, in his hand was a thin line of black. It was a blade almost 4 feet long. It sliced through the men and their gear as if they were nothing. My stomach turned as they fell to pieces. And it wasn't just my stomach. My head felt light and I almost fainted at the sight of 4 people being turned into chunks. The vines inside their bodies covered most of the gore, but I still couldn't look over at them for very long. It was enough for me to forget about the man wearing the lab coat as he's shuffling closer. I gasped, turning with my gun raised. He was almost within arm's reach, his hand raised and milky eyes staring without emotion. The bulb started to get bigger as his face hollowed out. I froze, watching as the man appeared to be drained as the thing on his chest started to open. If I didn't pull the trigger in the next second, I would be dead. My finger twitched, and yet I couldn't do it. I was unable to put enough pressure into that one digit to save my life. Nick was the one who saved me yet again. He knew he couldn't get around me in time. Instead, he wrapped one arm around my chest to drag my body back and out of harm's way as his other hand wrapped around my own holding the gun. He was the one who forced my finger down on the trigger and took the recoil of the weapon as it fired. With perfect aim, he fired 3 shots, one into the heart, the brain, and the bulb. Just when it looked as if the bulb would open, the bullets tore through the threat. The man collapsed, and the bulb shriveled up. Now dead along with the host, Nick released his grip. Without any hesitation, he went over to the fallen scientist to investigate the now dead bulb. He grabbed a hold to pull the dead plant from the man's chest. Slowly, the bulb started to fade away inside his hand. This bulb was created by supernatural means. I can absorb it to use it for energy like other magic-based things. But it must be dead to do so. I took care of a person inside the room, so we're down to dealing with. He paused speaking when his eyes landed on my trembling hand. I simply could not take my eyes off the dead man in front of me. Nick was speaking so coldly, and yet a man was dead. No, at least 6 people were dead. The logical part of my brain knew these people could not be saved, and it was a good thing they had been taken down, and yet my vision started to blur and I couldn't stop myself from breathing heavily. In my mind, I'd killed someone. I was the one who brought a gun, and now a man was dead. When I dreamed of being a cop, I knew I would need to shoot at someone if my life was in danger. I didn't ever want to do something like that, but assumed I would be ready if the time came. That I would be working the streets and toughened up by the time I would need to draw a gun on someone. But when the time really came, I froze. Then I had a panic attack after seeing the results. My mind was reeling in that moment. Any kind of logic and sensible thinking was tossed out the window. My breathing started to come in short, hitched breaths as I was unable to take my mind off the body at my feet. All the insecurities I desperately tried to push down came flooding in. That I was worthless. That I brought my sister down by going after an impossible-to-reach goal. That I would never become a real. Do you want to turn back? Nick asked in a soft tone, cutting off my thoughts. No, I can't. I protested. I was the one who asked you to bring me along on cases, and yet I act like this. I'm supposed to be your partner, and yet I haven't done a damn thing. My job is to support you, and yet I needed to stop speaking or else I would really lose it. Shutting my eyes tight, I kept the flood of emotions back the best I could. While in the dark, I felt Nick wrap his hands around my own that still tightly gripped the handgun. I opened my eyes again to look up at him. A real expression on his face instead of his regular blank look. Is this heavy? He asked, referring to my handgun. I nodded, so he kept speaking. Weapons should be heavy. They carry the weight of all the lives you can destroy with them. It's been a long time since my swords became light. I hate that. I need a partner who can still feel this weight. Until you're able to lift this on your own, I'll help carry it. We are partners after all. It goes both ways. I'm here to help you. You're not here to take on all the burdens on your own. I looked down, feeling a wave of embarrassment from his words. I'd gotten so freaked out seeing someone die for the first time I didn't let myself think properly. Nick knew about my lack of experience when he asked me to come along. He's always known, and yet he still wanted for us to work together. I needed to keep reminding myself I couldn't do much, but the things I could do helped out more than I could ever realize. I nodded, unable to think of a way to respond. Mentally, I swore I would work harder in order to support Nick better during our cases. He pulled away when more groaning came from down the hallway. Any softness in his posture disappeared as he snapped back into action, ready to fight. A clicking sound from his hand made me look down. His new sword was a thin jet black blade. It collapsed out of a small handle the size of a lipstick tube. It looked more like a baton than a sword. What happened to the orchestra? I asked, wondering about the change in weapons. I got in trouble from cutting the van in half. This blade is named Eel. Despite its size, it can cut through anything. Eel is a good temporary blade, but it makes me nervous because it's too eager to cut through living things. The groaning died down, so Nick felt it safe enough to further tell me about his weapon. The smaller blade was a better choice for this job. I've only seen the orchestra send out waves of destruction. I wasn't sure if it could tone it down. Here, we needed to take down people infected by some sort of parasitic plant, not destroy the entire building. Skylar, I still do not know how this infection spreads. Please stay back and cover me. I'll protect you. Only fire your weapon if you're able. Do not force it and put yourself in a bad situation. I was going to reply in some sort of negative way. I still felt as if I was useless. Not only did he have to worry about plant zombies, but he also needed to keep an eye on me. When he looked over his shoulder, he had the closest thing to a smile I've ever seen. And all those feelings faded. I kept a good grip on the handgun at my side, the cold metal feeling slightly lighter than before, now that I knew I was going to use it to protect my partner. When we knew we both were ready, we started back down the hallway towards whatever was waiting. I followed a few steps behind Nick as he moved slowly, completely alert and ready. I had my handgun drawn, but pointed down until I needed to fire. I didn't want to risk getting nervous and shooting my partner in the back by accident. We carried on clearing rooms without any more surprises. The building was massive. We finally found a map near a pair of elevators so we could figure out where things were. And so we could make a guess as to how many more surprises we might find based on what we found inside each cleared room. The biggest room on that floor was a cafeteria. We saved clearing that room for last. From my count, Nick had taken down 11 infected. That left a big number that still needed to be taken care of. A large group could be in the cafeteria and we needed to be ready because of Nick's skill. It didn't take us very long to finish the first floor aside from the last large room. We stopped outside the double doors. I made eye contact with him, showing I was ready. I had calmed down a great deal since our first encounter with the infected, and I almost felt as if I could handle the rest of our job without any issues. Slowly, Nick opened the door and slipped inside as I tried to do so as gracefully as he did. The room was colder than the rest of the building. It made me feel a bit chilly because of the sweat on my face that was cooling down. The area still smelled of freshly cooked dinner. At first, I didn't think any infected were inside the room, but soon found out that was a wrong assumption. I didn't see them at first because of the long tables in the way. Food still remained behind as if these people had been infected in the middle of dinner. Some plates were on the floor and drinks were knocked over. Whatever had happened, it had happened fast. One infected stood up from the floor looking around trying to see us. Then another. The fear of the two of us having to deal with a large crowd of infected suddenly became real. Nick wasted no time. Instead of running between tables and overturned chairs, he leapt on a table to run towards the swaying corpse. In one swift motion, he sliced off its head, getting ready to do the same to a second one. I was ready to cover him, but a sight made me freeze. A pile of the infected stood up in the middle of the room where a set of tables had been pushed aside. They were all connected by vines coming from the bulbs on their chests and running through their skin. At least 20 of them all turned their head towards Nick. He was trying his best to avoid other infected swatting at his feet as he darted along the tables. I raised my gun and fired into the crowd of infected, hoping that I would hit something with them being all so close together. Before my eyes, that small crowd became closer and closer until they turned into an abomination that would haunt my memories for the rest of my life. Vines twisted around bodies as they molded into one mass. I kept firing, hoping it would do something. If I killed one out of the crowd, the bulb didn't fade like before. It was still connected to others, so it stayed alive as they turned into something else. The final mass looked almost like a worm made of plant matter and human limbs. "Nick, fall back," I cried towards my partner. He made an attempt to do so, but to my horror, a vine came out of the monster in the middle of the room and wrapped around his ankle. It dragged him along while the other infected that were not a part of that huge mass reached out for him. His blade cut through the vine, dragging him a second too late. He was free, but another vine came down and pierced his chest as I yelled in shock. I fired until my gun clicked empty. Frantically, I dug around in my pocket for the ammo box I was smart enough to bring along. My hands shook, unable to even get the box open. Nick's face twisted in shock rather than pain. The pained expression came after the vine drew back. A hole in his chest didn't appear fatal, but from the look on his face and the way he started to dig at his chest, I could tell he'd become infected. He tore at his shirt, exposing the wound that now wriggled with vines digging around under his flesh. The infected didn't appear to care about him now that he was one of them, but the worm looked very interested. More vines came from the creature, ready to grab Nick to make him a part of itself. Unable to get my gun reloaded, I didn't even let myself think. I ran towards the mass. In his panic, Nick dropped his sword, the blade collapsing back into the small tube just before the other vines reached him. I ran between chairs and tables to grab a hold of the small object. The blade sprung forth the moment my hand wrapped around the metal. I slashed at the vines, cutting them dead in their tracks. I felt no resistance when I sliced through them. The infected noticed a new victim, though, now that I needed to protect Nick. I didn't freeze up as I sliced into a person stumbling in my direction. Nick was right about the eel being able to cut through anything. Without any effort, I cut through everything in my path. Vines, people, tables. From the sword, I could feel an excitement that was not my own. The blade wanted to cut. It was overjoyed at being used. It wasn't bothered by the fact I didn't know what I was doing or how to use it, as long as it sliced things. It kept getting happier and happier. It was unnerving because some of these things it wanted to cut through were normal people just a short while ago. In the chaos, I tried keeping my eyes on Nick. He'd gotten off the table and fallen to the floor. The sight worried me. He moved and I noticed that through his pain he was working away at something. Marker in hand, he was drawing another circle with odd writing on the outside. It gave me hope he knew of a cure, with the vines wriggling under his skin along his cheek. I knew he didn't have a chance unless he did something desperate. While I was distracted, The worm had gotten closer and was nearly on top of me. I didn't have enough room to swing eel to cut it in half, or even cut it at all. All of a sudden, Nick grabbed the back of my jacket and tossed me aside. I came down on a table hard enough to collapse it. It hurt, but I was more concerned over my partner. I sat up with a dark feeling of fear in my stomach. I tried moving back towards Nick. I cried out again as the worm wrapped itself around him, hiding him from view. I thought he was dead in that moment. I could never forgive myself if Nick didn't make it out of this building. I took an uneven step, ready to charge into attack, when whatever spellwork Nick created activated. A blast of heat burst from where he was. It was hot enough for me to feel it from where I was. Plastic tables closer to the worm started to melt from the heat. The creature couldn't get away, and it burst into flames seconds after the heat started. I could hear a screeching sound while a terrible burning smell filled the room. I coughed and squinted. The heat hurt my eyes, but I needed to know if Nick was all right. When the worm burned away, I could see him, his face twisted with pain. His clothing didn't appear to be affected by the heat. A whistling sound came from him as the vines under his skin could not withstand the sudden heat. They burned away in the same way the worm did. Yet Nick appeared flame-proof. It was only a few minutes until the heat died down. I was ready to make my way over to him. He stopped me with a raised hand. On his knees, he shook his head, looking terrible. Wait, just a few moments. His voice was low and hoarse. It killed me to stay away, but I needed to let the spot cool down, and I needed to clear the room. It was a big area, and we only checked the front half. Sword in hand, I started to go through the rest of the cafeteria. Aside from finding one infected in the walk-in freezer, it was safe. It appeared as if the infected acted slower in the cold. It barely even looked over at me as I brought the sword down to put it out of its misery. I grabbed a bag of ice and a bottle of water from the fridge to hurry back over to Nick. He was sitting against a half-melted table, looking better but still rough. His hair elastic didn't survive the heat wave and broke, causing his hair to fall around his face. He even loosened his tie, but the neutral expression was returning to his face and the hole in his chest was mostly healed. Nick accepted the bottle of water but didn't need the ice. He took small sips. I kept an eye out for any infected I may have missed. When he looked better, I gave up the sword to him, glad to no longer have it in my hand. The eel was hard to describe. It felt alive and was very overpowering. The longer I held it, the more it wanted to be used. A force was making my hand drift towards a table, wanting to cut it. When I refused, it started to put pressure on my hand to show me that it could force me to cut off my own leg if it wanted. I didn't understand how Nick used a sword like that. "How are you doing, Nicky?" I asked, keeping my voice soft. "I'll recover," he said, but still sounded awful. "How about we wait until backup comes? You said another team might arrive in an hour, right? You're hurt and we still don't know how many more infected are in the building." It was hard to count them before they turned into a worm. Nick shook his head at my offer. I was thinking he was hurt and we had done enough. But Nick was an agent after all. This may be one of the easier cases he's been on. I do not wish to risk this infection getting out of the building. It appeared the infected act slower in the cold. However, we have not excluded the possibility of the disease being airborne. It would only take one getting outside for an unknown amount of people to be harmed. As he spoke, I looked around the room, trying to remember what it looked like when we came in. It didn't really seem as if there was a massive struggle or fight that would have come from the infected sticking people with vines like what had happened with Nick. It appeared as if everyone who were sitting down and eating suddenly became infected and knocked over their chairs and food while in pain. It was a good sign of an airborne variant. The sooner we killed the ones remaining, the better chances we had of this not getting out. If Nick could still move, he would still work. "All right, we'll keep going, but only after you have recovered. Also gives me time to reload my gun," I replied as I sat next to him. The floor still felt warm. The smell of melted plastic was giving me a headache, and yet I still stayed by him. He watched as I carefully reloaded my handgun, making me feel nervous. I really hadn't needed to reload it many times because I had only bought it within the past week. With more practice, I could probably do it faster. But right then I was embarrassed at my lack of skill and fumbling fingers. I specialized in swords because I could never reload my weapon in the middle of a mission. I ended up dropping more bullets than I put in, Nick admitted. With his monotone voice, it was impossible to tell if he was joking or not. I decided to believe him. It made me smile knowing he was feeling well enough to try and encourage his partner. When he was ready and his face regained some color, he stood sword in hand. Neither of us had anything to tie his hair back, so he left it down. "We must both be cautious. My body cannot withstand burning out the infection a second time, even if it could. The marker that created the spell is almost out of power. I can still make the room sealing spells, but nothing as powerful as the heat spell." My fear returned when he spoke. If either of us got infected, that was it. Nick had one get out of jail free card and he had used it. I doubted there was a cure to this mystery infection because the building was wiped out. Surely the trained SWAT-looking men would have recovered it before things got out of control. Until that moment, I didn't even think about why the hunters had created such a thing. Perhaps it was meant to kill supernatural creatures, but one person working in the lab made a single mistake and doomed the rest of them. Thinking about the reason did not help us at the moment. We just needed to keep going on clearing the building and maybe answers would follow. Going around to the bodies that weren't burned up. Nick pulled the dead bulbs from their chest. He didn't want to risk leaving any traces behind. Once all the bulbs were destroyed, I fell into pace with him, the cafeteria now cleared. We could go down to the next floor, despite the building being so large. It only had 2 floors. The top floor was the living area, and the bottom floor held the labs. We truly didn't know what we would encounter on the second floor. The elevators still worked, so we stood next to each other ready to face the second floor together. The second floor was even darker than the first. We heard no movement as we made our way between desks. The only light coming from computer monitors. The place looking as if everyone just stopped working for the night. Everything in order and chairs pushed in. Nick had better senses than I did. He was able to tell that there wasn't anything hiding in the dark and we could move on to the next room, opening a door on the far side of the office area. Light poured out. Nick went in first, and after a few seconds I followed, blinking in the bright light. For a moment I couldn't believe what I was seeing. In the middle of the room was a massive tree that reached the ceiling, all encased in glass. It was as if the entire building was created around this one tree. Butterflies fluttered from between flowers in front of the tree. It was as if someone took a piece of summer and placed it inside a massive glass jar. I walked over towards the glass, completely awestruck. Nick was looking through some of the computers attempting to get answers. A force drew me to the glass and I placed a hand on the cool surface. The noise of my partner typing faded as I stared into the small grassy field. A slight movement caught my eye and fear spiked through my body until I saw what was on the other side of the glass. A child poked its small head from behind the tree. I would never have expected to see something so small and innocent in this place. Carefully, the little thing came out and started to take small steps towards me. I watched, unable to take my eyes away. It was impossible to tell the gender of the child. It was dressed in a small hospital gown that tied up in the back, and had silver hair so long it reached the ground. Not just a gray color, but honestly silver. It caught the light, sparkling in ways I've never seen hair glitter before. The hair covered the child's face, and I felt myself wanting to find a way past the glass to scoop this little thing up and get it away from this place. Finally, it reached the glass. I got down low so we could be eye to eye. A small hand was placed on the glass trying to reach my own. "Skylar, please step away from the glass." Nick's voice startled me. I shot back up, feeling as if I was just waking from a dream. The child was still there, proving it was real. I didn't even notice Nick's posture for a moment. I was still starstruck from seeing the beautiful tree in the middle of the room. He looked stiff and had eel extended in his hand. I was confused as to why he looked so tense. "What's going on?" I asked slowly, my head still feeling foggy. "That child is the cause of this infection. The hunters created the disease from its blood. They were unable to make a cure, so I must finish the job I arrived here to do," he said in a voice that sounded so cold it hurt my chest. A sound from my side made me turn. The child somehow melted the glass while Nick was speaking. They made a hole just large enough to climb out of. I really should have been afraid. Instead, when the small creature nearly fell out of the hole, I caught it. The little one with the silver hair felt so light and perfect in my arms. I've never really liked kids, but whatever this creature was, it was different. "What are you implying?" I asked, bringing the child closer, trying to protect them. "I've told you before, I am an executioner. I was tasked to wipe out the infection and the cause," Nick said, no longer looking or even sounding like himself. "Nicholas, it's just a kid," I protested, when he took a step forward, his sword at his side. I stepped back until I bumped against the glass. The child wrapped their arms around my neck, appearing frightened of Nick. I just couldn't believe what he was saying. It was not this child's fault others turned their blood into something deadly. It just wasn't right to kill them because there was a chance someone else would twist a part of their blood again to make a weapon. "Please, just stop for a second. I can't let you hurt an innocent child. It's just not right. Let's just figure something out," I pleaded, only to have Nick approach further. The sound of his slow steps echoed through the room. A feeling rose into my throat, one I've never felt before. It was something that went beyond fear and into sudden guilt. When he started to raise eel, my body also moved. My hand acted on its own. I reached for my handgun, the metal feeling ice cold. When Nick fully raised his sword, I also drew my weapon. In reflex, I was pointing it towards him and holding the child tighter with my other arm. The agent froze and I lowered my gun, horrified over what I had just done. I just pointed a gun at Nick. I knew I could never bring myself to fire, but that didn't change what I just did. This man swore to protect me and took me despite all my faults, and this was how I repaid him. I choked out and apologized. feeling as if I could never say the right words to be forgiven. Nick's face was a blank slate of ice, not even reacting to the incident. I jumped when the door on the other side of the room opened. 2 men came through, both wearing suits and without any bulbs on their chest. They looked like they were our backup. Nick lowered his sword before they spotted him. "We're Team 2. It looks like you have done most of the job already. What else is left for us to help with?" the taller agent with black hair asked, just as Nick was going to reply. Another sound made us all jump. A vent cover in the ceiling came crashing down along with what had pushed it off. A terrible crack echoed as a body slammed into the white tile floor. If they hadn't been dead from the infection, the fall would have killed them. The body was broken at impossible angles and a bulb was sticking from its chest. The person had tried to get away and hid in the air vents but was infected anyway. I watched as the body started to decompose. Nick bolted trying to reach the body before it was too late, instead of the bulb dying with its host. It was draining it before they both died in the next few seconds. The bulb grew to a bright red until it finally opened into a beautiful blood-red flower. Red spores burst out and covered the room before any of us could stop it. I held my breath, but I knew I'd already inhaled some spores. My mind was a blank and numb with fear. These spores were the airborne version of the infection. Through the red air, I thought I saw Nick look over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with fear. We should have all died in that room. It was a small miracle we didn't. The child I was still holding shook their head and silver dust came floating out, overtaking the red in the air. When my lungs burned and my vision started to fade, I gasped and breathed in the silver air. I waited for the infection to take over. Then nothing happened. The 2 new agents looked as if they both had a heart attack but were fine. Nick's expression returned to a normal blank one. I still couldn't believe I was alive. The hunters that made the infection and died because of it somehow never knew the cure was the child. Either the child never cared enough to save them, or was never in a position to do so. Eel was collapsed back and Nick went over to the 2 agents to explain what was going on. As they spoke, I held the small creature that saved us, but found it impossible to look over at Nick after what happened between us. I expected to be sent home now that a cure was discovered, but instead, I was told to follow the agents. I was being brought to an office belonging to the corporation. I never saw what the outside of the office looked like or where it was located. 2 doors were connected, so I stepped right out of the hunter's lab and into the office. With some persuasion, the child was taken from my arms. They promised I could see the little one later and nothing was going to happen to them. We both appeared displeased with the separation but accepted it. I was led down hallway after hallway. Wherever Nick ended up, they never told me. I was led to a door with the name Anchor set into the polished wood and gold lettering. When my guide left, I knocked on the door, unaware of what to expect. A gruff voice told me to enter. Inside was a grand office. Bookshelves with countless and well-organized volumes lined the wall. A large, dark wood desk sat next to the back of the room. There were even a set of small couches and a coffee table in the middle of the room. It looked like a rich man's lounge room right down to the plush carpet. A man stood behind the desk and I immediately disliked him. He was tall and made of muscle. His suit looked ridiculous on his frame, but he was the type of person no one would say that to his face. Long reddish hair circled his neck like a mane. It was clear from his clawed hands and sharp teeth this man was not human. I took my time walking across the room into the chair in front of his desk. He scowled at me, displeased, and the feeling was mutual. "So, you're the one who Nicholas has been running around with. What a small thing you are. Human as well. How useless." His voice was so deep it was almost hard to hear what he was saying. "I'm sorry, but who are you again?" I asked, not liking his tone. "Nicola's boss and the highest-ranking agent in this sector. You should watch your attitude. I was the one who approved the cases you participated in. If you wish to continue, we need to make this more official." I kept my opinions to myself as he tossed a stack of papers in front of me. A pen followed them and rolled off his desk, making it so I needed to pick it up. I still stayed silent as I started to read the first few sentences. "You are not becoming an agent," Anchor explained. "This is just giving you permission to partner with Nicholas with very minor cases. If you die on one of these, your family shall get a lump sum. Very low considering you're not even a contract worker. As far as I can tell, you're just a cheerleader on the sidelines looking pretty but not actually doing a damn thing." Rage started to bubble in my stomach. I kept it down as I flipped through the papers. They pretty much said what he had just explained. Most of the text was explaining the many ways an agent could die and how they were all covered for the life insurance deal. Agents didn't even need to pay into it, due to the fact so few even had families or anyone after they died. The corporation could easily cover a massive payout on the rare occasion it happened without having to collect for it. The forms were simple and I filled them out, signing where needed. I tossed the papers back on his desk, the pen rolling forward but not quite off the desk. I was still impressed by it trying to roll towards freedom. Anchor didn't even touch the papers. He looked disgusted over the fact I was even in his office. If there isn't anything else, I would like to get back home. Me and my partner had a long night, I said, getting ready to stand up from the very stiff chair I was in. The man looked down, his face twisted and large sharp teeth exposed. I can tell why Nicholas picked you. He was always making the mistake of taking in fragile feminine strays. He spat out, keeping his voice low but filled with hate. I've never been so angry in my life. I saw red and shot to my feet before I even knew what I was doing. This man could crush me with his pinky, and yet I still acted. Neither of us did something we regretted because a voice from the doorway made us stop. "Mr. West, could you come with me, please?" a pleasant voice asked. I looked over to see a tall, dark-skinned woman smiling in my direction. She was wearing a lab coat and her name tag was too far away for me to read. Abarash. "How many times have I told you to knock before you enter my office?" Anchor said at the newcomer, his voice practically a growl. He may dislike me, but he hated her. "And how many times have I told you I'm more important than you? You may be able to knock over brick buildings, but you can't think yourself out of a paper bag. This company needs brains, not brawn, so Anchor, ever so kindly, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, shut the fuck up." My mouth dropped open. I looked from one to the other. Abarash was smiling and Anchor grinding his teeth. I was waved overcome by Abarash, so I quickly crossed the room to leave with her. She still smiled as she slammed the door behind us. The moment it was closed, we could hear the large man starting to tear apart his furniture in a rage. At least it wasn't one of us. God, he's such a raging dick, Abarash said with her hands on her hips. She looked down at me with a wink. Golden bulky necklaces clanked when she moved and they stood out against her nearly pitch black skin. Her hair was shaved very close to her skull and golden bulky earrings dangled under her ears, looking perfect against her skin tone. I would never admit this out loud in fear of embarrassment, but she was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, and I fell in love with her the moment she spoke. "Yeah, he seems like he has issues. Anyway, did you need me for something?" I asked as she started to guide me down the hallway and away from the noisy office. "No, not really. I figured you wouldn't want to be stuck with that man for too long, but since I have you, do you want to hang out with the kid you guys brought back for a little while?" We quickened our pace. I was glad I could see the child again so soon. Inside the office was a daycare, or a place where agents could drop off their children if they had any. There were 2 children there. The one we found in the lab was now dressed in real clothing and playing with some toys. The moment they saw me, I was tackled by the 2 kids. I gladly sat down with them as Abarash explained what they had decided on. They would find a family to adopt the child and would refuse to let the hunters have access to it. The poor little thing didn't even have a name. The corporation wasn't certain of what species the child was. Abarash was the one who gave it a quick checkup and found, as far as she could tell, that the mystery child didn't have a gender. I was given the option of naming the child squirming happily in my arms. "Do you think Luna is too girly of a name?" I asked as I brushed my fingers through the silver threads of hair. I was given a smile showing how much Abarash liked the name. It was decided that I could see Luna whenever I wanted, and I was given a number to reach my new crush if needed. I wanted to stay a little longer, but I was kindly kicked out. The kids needed to sleep, and I also had a long day to think about and needed to decompress. The next few days after that case were torture. Nick hadn't replied to any of my texts. We didn't get a chance to talk after everything that happened. I feared he hated me. I didn't care about losing a well-paying job. I didn't even notice the payment for the last case for a while. I found it impossible to sleep or eat much as I tried to get in contact with my partner. Finally, Nick sent me a message asking to meet in the park briefly before he went on a case, as the job was too dangerous to take me along. Him wanting to talk was a good sign. The stress nearly kept me in the house. I sucked it up and was ready to face whatever he rightfully felt. I spotted him and waved. When he turned around and waved back, I gasped at the sight of his face. Half of it was bruised and swollen. His hand was wrapped in bandages. I didn't understand how he was so injured and still wore a neutral expression. Snickers. "What on earth happened?" I asked, another forbidden nickname slipping out. At first, Nick wasn't aware I was speaking to him. He looked around to see who Snickers was before he realized I was slightly injured during a training program. He explained as if it wasn't a big deal. "Can't you heal yourself really fast? Did this just happen? Express healing takes up triple the energy. It's not worth it. This shall heal in a few days," Nick replied, waving off my concern. Aside from his bruises, he looked normal, or well, as normal as Nick could be. I stood, feeling guilty because of how I acted in our last case. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, so I went right for it. "I wanted to apologize to you. What I did, it was pretty unforgivable," I said as my voice started to choke up. I waited for a response. each second my chest getting tighter and more painful. "What are you talking about?" Nick asked in an even voice. I stared at his face, trying to read his expression. He truly appeared to not know what I was feeling so guilty over. He either didn't notice I'd raised my gun at him while protecting Luna, or he didn't care. "Nick, I pointed a gun at you. We are supposed to be a team, and yet I trailed off, unable to even look at him. "It's fine. If I killed the child when we first saw them, we may both be dead by now. That child held the cure, and that's not the point," I snapped. People in the park looked in our direction, and I felt my face flush. When I calmed down a little, Nick spoke again. "I need a partner like you. Sometimes I need to be told I'm doing the wrong thing, and it's hard to stand up to someone you care about. I respect that you stood your ground and did something that got my attention to stop me." I just couldn't believe this guy. He really wasn't human, because there wasn't another person of the same species as me that was so damn nice. I fought down any further disagreement, knowing Nick would just dismiss it. "You need to stop being so damn understanding," I told him. A hint of a smile flickered on my face. He let my words run through his head a few times before he responded. "I never thought anyone would ever call me understanding. When it comes to interacting with people, I don't know what's going on most of the time." I laughed. I couldn't help it. I don't know why I was ever worried or thought Nick could hate me. He couldn't hate anyone. He just didn't have any sort of negative emotions in him. Rustling around in his pocket, he pulled out his pink flip phone with all the charms. I thought he was going to make a call, but instead he started to remove one of the charms from the collection. It was a plastic ruby that glittered in the sunlight. A trinket, but still pretty. "Here. I wanted to give you this. It was my old partner's favorite." He only spoke after I had taken it. If I had known who it had belonged to, I wouldn't have taken such an important thing. Such a small object felt heavy in my hands. I started. What made me stop and accept the gift was that Nick smiled. It was the smallest smile I've ever seen, but still a smile. I clutched the fake ruby in my hand, understanding how important it was. "She would have gotten along with you. It's the reason why I called you for the second case. You may not be able to see it now, but I do need you. So please, keep working with me." There was no way I could ever refuse him when he asked so sincerely. No matter what, Nick would see some positive qualities in myself that I couldn't, to pay him back for still wanting me as his partner. I swore I would work harder. He expected me to just show up, but now I needed to put forth 100% into every case he brought me on. I may still have some self-doubts, but I couldn't let them hold me back. His phone started to ring, and he turned away to answer it. By the sound of things, he was late for a dangerous job. "When you get back, please dig around and find us a case to finish. I want to keep working hard on solving these smaller jobs with you." I thought I saw Nick smile again, but it might have been a trick of the light. He promised another case in the future, but couldn't give me a time frame. No matter when he called again, and no matter what kind of job, I would be waiting for him. Until then, I needed to sign up for some self-defense courses, or at the very least start jogging to get into shape.